Hi, I'm Jeff Nyquist, and this is Friends and Enemies, and we are doing our series on conflicts of the 20th century, and we're in the Cold War. We're in the middle of it, and what we want to cover this week, and probably is going to take more than 1 week, is the relationship between the Jews. Jewish conspiracy theory is used during the Cold War, and the Middle East and the Arab world, the Arab-Israeli conflict, how that comes to be part of the Cold War, how it fits in, and how we can understand it. And of course, we have to go back to the Balfour Declaration in Great Britain, where the British basically said that they were committing themselves to a Jewish state in Palestine. Of course, during World War I, the British were invading the Turkish Empire. The Turkey controlled the Middle East to set the stage, the Turkish Empire. And so with the British coming in, you have T.E. Lawrence. Those of you who've seen the movie Lawrence of Arabia, he was a British agent that went in among the Arabs. And he was an Arabist. He spoke fluent Arabic. He won over Arabs. And of course, at the same time that Great Britain was promising a Jewish state to the Jews, because they were hoping the Jews in the Middle East, because there was a large Jewish settlement of, I think it was over 100,000, maybe 200,000 Jews in Palestine. They were appealing to the Arabs and saying, we will give you a state. Of course, the British were rather treacherous in this. They weren't really seriously going to set up a state for anybody that wasn't a puppet state of them and the French. And of course, at the end of World War I, the French and British disappointed the Arabs and the Jews by dividing the Middle East between them and setting up a puppet state in Iraq. So this is kind of the setting stage for the Middle East, but also we're going to talk about the effect of the protocols, which becomes not only important for Nazi Germany, and Nazis wanted to get into the Middle East. They were hoping that Rommel's armies would reach Palestine, and they had plans. The Nazis had plans, and this is Norman Cohn's Warrant for Genocide. It's probably the best book on the Jewish world conspiracy myth that is you can read, and it's really goes into detail about the protocols of the Elders of Zion, the myth of the Jewish Masonic conspiracy. And, lots of people who believe in that, like it's their religion, are going to be hearing my words going, oh, you're Nyquist, you're just a shill of the Jews, And the thing is that, just to give my background, I'm not associated with Jewish intelligence or Mossad or the Jewish state. I'm not a propagandist for Israel. I grew up with Arab and Jewish friends as a child, so I heard both sides of the Middle East conflict growing up. One of my sister's best friends was Lebanese Christian. In my church, there were Palestinian Christians, that family that was in my church. And so I heard growing up both the Jewish side and the Arab side. So I don't have a dog in this fight. I don't want to have to choose between my Arab friends and my Jewish friends in this. But it is a very complicated story. But the Russians saw this conflict between Jews and Arabs and anti-Semitism as a weapon. So go ahead, Alex, tell me how you see this.
Okay, so obviously anything to do with Israel, Jews is such a loaded topic, and the conventional conspiracy mythology is so large, and it's been made so strong by various actors, state actors and non-state actors in the world for a very long time for various purposes. And so because the mythology is so strong, when you talk about these topics and you don't adopt this mythology, you are being accused of either being a Jew yourself or being part of the Jewish conspiracy, right? And people can check out two older shows that we've done, with the Friends and Enemies program. One is called Fake Experts, and the other one is called Fake Experts Part 2, because I've done my own study on 200 years worth of conspiracy media People can find that as a book actually on Amazon, and so people can check out all that stuff. And I have so many more notes and new notes about all of this. So, me personally, in my circle of people, there are no Jews because there's almost no Jews in Germany whatsoever, for obvious reasons, because Germans killed them all, or a lot of them were actually Jewish Germans or German Jews, whatever you want to call them. Some had maybe a Jewish grandfather, and just they all got selected into this category, Jews, the enemy, the destroyers of Roman-style empires and all that. And so, they were tabulated with these tabulating machines and hunted. And
I might
killed.
note that I might note, Alex, that I saw the statistic this week in doing background research that almost half of the Jews killed in the Holocaust were not practicing Jews. They were either Christians, Jews that had converted, or they were agnostic, not practicing any religion.
Yeah.
So,
and there's
their Jewishness was really that wasn't a thing.
And also, people can check out historical photos from the vast bureaucracy of the Holocaust, because all that crap survived. Okay, so you may not find the perfect pieces of evidence from the leadership, because they try to cover up some tracks. Of course, not all of them, but the vast bureaucracy of the Holocaust survived because it was so large, and you can find some of these photos in various archives and also printed in some books, and you see these people when they were rounded up. They were photographed and mugshotted basically, and you can see a lot of people that look spectacularly German, right? And so this became part of this idiotic notion of the Nazis back then, and also people even before that. Whereas some of these people, they claimed they could spot a Jew, right? So even if a Jewish person looks very, very German, they could tell who's a Jew and who is not.
It's ridiculous. Reinhard Heydrich, who headed the Reich Security Office of the SD.
Crazy man of Prague.
Right. One of the secrets, you'll read it in the memoirs of people like Schellenberg, Walter Schellenberg and others, that he was hiding a secret, that he was part Jewish. And there's a quote that someone, I can't remember who said it about him, that Himmler had told them that, well, since he's part Jewish, he will work all the harder for us to remove that stain from him. Very, very weird. So there were even leading Nazis, and of course the main guy at Der Stürmer. I think that you had what was it? Your great uncle worked for.
Yeah,
he turned out Stryker. Yeah, he was Jewish. It turns out he was a Jew.
Yeah, and right? It was pretty dumb. And
at Nuremberg, they find out. They're shocked. They're putting this Nazi up on trial, and they find out the guy was a Jew.
Yeah. And I still get this nonsense even today. Some of these internet heroes, these internet warriors, they claim to be able to tell who is a Jew, right? Because they have the special sixth sense to spot. They have a Jewish radar, so to say. So people still do that, and I got that a couple of times over the years. People saying that, oh, you're Jewish because I can sense that you're Jewish. So people still do that today. But I'm just gonna show something here on the screen real quick. This is from our personal family records and photo albums, because obviously when you're German, your photo albums are full of Nazis, full of people in full uniform and all the whole 9 yards.
And of course, just to let the listeners know, you're broadcasting from Bavaria. I'm here in the upper Midwest, but you're in Bavaria.
So right next, of the 10 kilometers in this or the other direction is Nuremberg, and you have all the historical sites where these big rallies took place and all that nonsense. And so obviously, the people on my father's side of the family and the people on my mother's side of the family, everybody had to get background checked. So you wanted to marry, you wanted to run for office or you wanted to be in the SS or whatever, you had to get what's called an Ahnenpass. They will check your family several generations back, maybe 200 years or something like that. And so we still have some of these records, the Ahnenpass records. So everybody in the family had to be checked. So I'm going to put something on the screen real quick here, also from our personal records here. So this man is Theo Benesch, same last name as myself. So we have these photos. We're the only people in the world who have these photos, right? So nobody else has them. And so there's a Wikipedia page on him. And there's, Bavarian records on him and some, national records on him.
He was your grandfather's brother?
He was my father's uncle. And my father grew up with him for a while, when my father was very small. So, and so this guy, he was a true believer, okay? So he became a big shot in the Nazi party locally, then one of the highest people in Bavaria, and ultimately he went to Berlin, to the parliament in Berlin. And one of the jobs that he had over the years, he worked at Der Stürmer, the infamous, conspiracy anti-Jewish publication. He was filling in because they thought they needed him for that. So he held various positions. At some point, he was almost like one of the leading editors responsible for almost anything that was printed in that rag. So here he's sitting on his desk, looking very proud, and in the same eyes. My father had the same eyes. And there's multiple people in the family. Most people in the family are almost men in the family. They had some sort of they're trained engineers, so they're not trained in history. They're not intelligence officers. They're not people who know about. They were not people who know about the empires and the intelligence world. So here you see him on the screen. This was pretty close to World War I. Now he was very young in the war, for obvious reasons. I think he was almost born in the same year as Martin Bormann, for that matter. And this is actually a postcard. So he had this photo made, and on the backside he wrote a text to his family. And here he's standing smoking a cigarette. He fought at various different locations, and he was cold as ice. I mean, everybody described him as cold as a block of ice. He was unfazed by everything. Very strange character. And this here is this is a German official record.
It looks like Geboren, that's his birth date. Geboren 21st January 1899. Okay.
He's I think that it's called, what is it called? Frakturschrift. This is like an old type font that they used, and it's a little bit hard to read, but
it's pretty.
Yeah, and it's like it says he was imprisoned multiple times. When the Nazi Party was fairly young, because at some point the Nazi Party was banned in several parts of Germany, and at some point I think it was banned in the entire country. But he was sticking to his guns. He was a true believer because he read the older conspiracy literature that was very popular in Germany. So he thought he knew it all, like all those internet warriors of today. So he went to prison multiple times. And when you actually joined that early, when you joined the Nazi movie that early, you had the best chances of a larger career. Same with Martin Bormann, was a very early adopter of this nonsense. And of course, Theo also had a very big career. Now he's in front of a very spiffy car at the time. Now, cars were rare in Germany. They didn't have many cars, especially not the fancy ones here. Yeah, of course, this is the Stürmer, and this is another shot at his very nice desk here. And there's like an older picture, and this is of course his party button that you see here. is
So what
very.
happened to him at the end of the war? Did he die?
Well, he wasn't. He tried several things, business-wise, to reestablish himself. But various ideas. He pursued various ideas, and ultimately he died in an accident. But others in the family, they were also engineers. They had a company in Ansbach, which made precision gears, like anything precise and made out of metal, they would actually do that. So this is the family. So nobody was, as far as I could tell, nobody was ever an intelligence officer.
So
Nobody
you're
were
not a Mossad operative
definitely
with that
not.
background. No.
Definitely not. So nobody knew anything about intelligence in the family. Nobody was ever like an intelligence officer. Nobody was a proper historian. Nobody knew the empires and how they functioned. So they thought by knowing contemporary conspiracy literature, they thought they knew it all. They could run a state. They could run an empire. They knew who the bad guys were. They knew what to do. And of course, this was complete garbage.
A sort of a very stupid view of the world, misconstruing things and simplifying everything down to, as Hitler said in Mein Kampf, to one enemy, right? Germany, we can't tell the Germans, he says in Mein Kampf, we can't tell the Germans they have all these enemies we fought against during the war. We have to reduce it to one enemy. And he, of course, reduced it to the Jews.
And also the entire communist, or as it was called back then, the entire Bolshevik phenomenon was declared a Jewish phenomenon. Maybe we should say a little bit about that, because
Jewish Bolshevism was Hitler's way of understanding communism.
We had people like Lenin, who had, if I'm not mistaken, one Jewish grandfather who converted to Christianity, and all the other ancestors of Lenin were just Russians. You had guys like Trotsky. His father didn't care about religion. His mother cared somewhat, but ultimately Trotsky was just a Russian. And some others in the Bolshevik movement, they came from, or formerly came from, very low ranks of the Russian aristocracy, and a lot of the revolutionaries, they came from sort of this bourgeois, lower grade, part of society, that people who didn't have that much, but they had some sort of an education. And of course, if you want to make a Bolshevik revolution, you not only need the warriors, the peasants that you can make sign a contract and give them a rifle and some training. You need the grunts, but you also need some more educated people, right? And so this is where they were looking. This tiny little middle class in Russia, and some of the members had some Jewish background, some more, some less, because they thought, and I think even Lenin said this once, if you wanted to find some smarter people in Russia, an easy way was to find some people that had some, Jewish background, and that was the whole thing, basically.
The Jews valued literacy. Because they were persecuted people, they had to have literacy. They emphasized it in their children. And what happened is that during the Russian Civil War, there was a strike of government staff. I don't remember what it was about. Solzhenitsyn writes about it in his 200 Years Together, about the Jews and the Russians. And in this strike, how could the Bolshevik government break the strike? But they had to bring in Jews. Jews were the only literate pool of people they could hire to break this strike of government workers. And so this is what ended up happening. This is how a lot of Jews got into the administration of the Bolshevik government. It wasn't started by Jews. They came into it as workers at the middle level to break a strike. And so there's a lot of misunderstandings. And of course, people talk a lot about Kamenev and Zinoviev and Trotsky. But in reality, as we've mentioned before on the show, analysis of the first Politburo, they weren't all Jews. They weren't
Yeah.
even a majority of them weren't
Yeah,
Jews.
and
I mean, these
it
were
was just, it
mostly
was a bunch of
non-Jews.
Russians. It was a bunch of Russians, and this narrative was created that, communism came from the outside and it was forced on Russia and all that. But ultimately, it was Russians. Russians did that to Russia, and also, some of these operatives like Lenin, they spent some time in Europe. Of course, we know that. This is not a secret, of course. But of course, this is what revolutionaries do. They try to go to safe territory and network and do stuff, and then they try to go back home and do a revolution. So this was a bunch of Russians, and also Lenin's father was a legit aristocrat. He was doing some improvements for the school system in Tsarist Russia, and he did such a
He was
spiffy
a
job.
school administrator.
Yeah,
In
and
fact,
he did.
Lenin's uncle basically paid for his father to go through school to become a successful school administrator. And his father was a pretty good guy, Lenin's father, who was really well liked and they had a wonderful family, except Lenin was in it.
Yeah, so
Lenin was the odd child, was the
Yeah.
bad child, you could say.
And so there's a bunch of people that joined the Bolshevik movement, and also besides these lower, besides the bourgeois people that the social climbers or whatever, you also had the lower rank, or the lower ranks of the Russian aristocracy, and we know that many of the so-called whites, right? Many of the so-called whites, they became Reds. They joined the communist or Bolshevik movement, and we know that some regiments at the end of the Civil War, some of these regiments, they had 80% or more officers that used to be of the white group. So it's like this is the Russian Revolution and the Bolshevism and the Russian Civil War. It's a very, very complex bit of history, and it involves intelligence agencies and it's like, and some of the stuff is even still secret. We don't have all the answers, and so it's a complex thing. But it's always an easy thing to call it Jewish and say that's your answer.
Right. So so the Jews, and of course you have Zionism, which is you could call it an agrarian socialist kind of ideology, but it's the movement for a Jewish homeland in Palestine, and of course you've got a lot of people coming. What they did is the Jews bought this worthless, at first they bought worthless swampland in Palestine that the Arabs wouldn't touch. And the Arabs had kind of let the land, they had brought in what they call black goats into there, and they ate the grass down to the roots. And of course, the topsoil blew away. So this once rich land that had been, the ancient Israel had been desertified by these black goats that the Arabs conquerors had brought in. And so the Jews came in, they were going to restore the land, and they created societies for it, and they immigrated, and they took this. A lot of Jews died from malaria clearing these swamplands, and so you had these Jewish settlers coming, a lot of them from the Russian Empire, by the way, because they were persecuted because of the protocols, because of the Black Hundreds, which was an anti-Semitic pro-Tsarist organization in Russia. There were terrible pogroms against the Jews, and so they came to the Middle East, especially from Russia in those days. And of course, it was harder to get the prosperous Jews from Germany and Western Europe to come there because they had businesses, they were doing well in Europe. No reason for them to have the hardship of being pioneers. And then, of course, the Arabs, there was this, when this was happening, it was all under the Turkish Empire, right? The Turkish Empire controlled this area when this first started, the first Jews started. And of course, there had always been, I should emphasize, probably around 50,000 Jews had always lived in the area, even despite when the Romans, had those two terrible wars in the 1st and 2nd century with the Jews, these Jewish wars, where a lot of Jews were dispersed and they were forced out. There were always Jews that remained, that tilled the soil, that lived in the Holy Land. So that just as to the Jews had always been there. The Arab invasions, when they erupted out of Arabia after the death of Muhammad, they conquered, within 100 years, they conquered all the way up to France. They went all the way across the Middle East, through Africa, up into Spain and into France. And then, of course, the Turks, they later converted to Islam, and the Turkish became part of of course, they're not Arabs, but, just like the Persians were not Arabs. These other, ethnic groups became Muslim. Yeah. So this is kind of the background. Yeah.
Now that you mention it, this is really important. The Turks, they used to be what they call Seljuks. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing this correctly, because I think our pronunciation might be different. But they were Seljuks, and at some point, the Islamic imperialism had progressed to a certain degree, where you had some established people in Islam. Okay, they had money, they had power, and they were tired of doing the fighting themselves, because it's inherently dangerous, of course. And so they had to find new guys to convert, and so these new guys would do the fighting, and and then dividing up what was gained by these conquests. So this is what the Turks ultimately did. They converted, and they did all the fighting, and at some point the Turks were running the caliphate, the giant Muslim empire. And there's some really good books out there, scientific, really solid books about Islamic imperialism, because that imperialism worked with the same rules as, for the most part, as all the other types of imperialism. And it's something that I think that people nowadays forget, or they never really read about it. When you look at Greta Thunberg, the climate the climate activist, and Greta Thunberg is now associating herself with the Palestinians, right? As if Israel was the empire, the Jewish imperialism. Whereas you have a very long documented history of Islamic imperialism. And so Jews, when you go back a long time, Jews had these very small states, and there were these incredibly large empires around them. And this was sort of always in flux. So this one empire would be dominating the area, then there was another empire that was dominating the area. This was always shifting.
Jews, the Jews, when they had their country, in ancient times, they had to deal with the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, and then the Persians, and they came under the Persian Empire. And then after the Greeks came in, they had Antiochus the Great. There's where the Maccabees come from, revolting against Antiochus, and then Rome. Yes, of course. And then the real trouble with Rome. And of course, the Jews were distinctive in the ancient world because they were monotheistic people. The Persian religion, they kind of had two gods, a good and evil one, if I understand it right. And but the Jews were the monotheists. And of course, most of the peoples of the ancient world, the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Babylonians, the Romans, they were polytheists. So they believed in a pantheon of gods, a whole group of gods that represented different activities and things and planets and so on. And so they had, everything was divvied up. And of course, this made the Jews stand out as being not like everybody else.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly. Just like Christianity, Christianity later, it was just not compatible with this Roman system. And at some point there was a significant Jewish uprising, to get autonomy or more autonomies to some sort.
In 68 AD, the first big one, the Jewish War, which was a horrific war. Maybe as many as 1 million people died.
The Romans sent the Romans sent what was it, 60,000 soldiers, professional.
They sent an army. A Roman army is typically around 60,000, which would be about 10 legions.
Yeah. So they had, I think in total, if there was a major outside threat, I think the Romans estimate, this is an estimate, of course, I think the Romans could have mobilized the Romans could have mobilized an army of maybe 500,000 people, maybe more, but this is just pushing it to a silly
But
degree, right?
they were holding down this empire. So
Yeah.
well, the Romans, I don't know that the Romans ever had 500,000 men at once,
No,
except
no, they
maybe
never
later in
had
the
it, but
empire. Yeah.
they never had that. But I think I read that in one of the better books on the Roman Empire. If they had to give it all, if they had to really
Mobilize
mobilize
everybody.
who could be a professional, if push comes to shove, they could have had maybe 500,000, but this would have not been sustainable for any longer time because of the supplies and everything. But this is just to give people the dimensions of this. So if you send 50,000-60,000 professional soldiers to kill Jews, they can kill a lot of Jews.
Yeah, I mean, the Roman army typically, I think, was maybe 20 to 30 legions at any one time, and often much lower than that number in times of peace that were mobilized. But yeah, this Jewish war was a tremendous thing. And of course, with the death of Trajan, Trajan was the one who Romanized Romania. Trajan then invaded Parthia, or Persia, what we know as Iran, and he defeated them, but he died right as he was victorious. And of course, Hadrian took over, and this is the moment the Jews had major holdings in Cyprus. So the core of this second Jewish rebellion was in Cyprus and also in the Holy Land. And they had, this was really horrific. This fighting was really bad. And the Romans really cracked down on the Jews at this point. And of course, you had, the Jews really became a pariah people under the Roman Empire. And a lot of people don't know this, but during the Roman Empire, 1 in 10 people were Jewish.
Yeah.
They weren't a tiny minority like they later were. They were, I mean, that's 1 in 10. That's a huge percent of the population of the Roman Empire. And to be a pariah, to be at war with the Roman Empire, to be suppressed by the Roman Empire, because the Roman Empire, I mean, it was huge. It encompassed all kinds of people. But the Jews, from the time of the Babylonian captivity, had been dispersed by earlier conquests. So there were Jews, just like there were Greek traders and Greek cities everywhere. The Jews were sort of dispersed throughout the Roman Empire and the Greek world. That's important to say. So they were accustomed to being a diaspora people. That is, a people that had gone from their homeland and had many people living in other countries.
Yeah, and obviously the Roman system, they already had a somewhat sophisticated system of espionage. Now, there are newer studies out, and these newer studies, they say that the espionage in Rome was bigger than previously thought. So this is still a developing part of history, because we don't have perfect records. We don't have all the records, and this was oftentimes run by families. It's off the books and everything. So the Romans, when the Romans would acquire, so to say, a new population, there was always kind of a same deal offered. So you have to treat the Roman emperor as like a god. You have to do the worship stuff with the emperor. You have to pay the taxes, and you can't do anything against Roman interests, obviously. But there was also, and this is sort of implied, there was also an element of espionage. So not just the Romans would spy on the Jews, the Romans would force some Jews to spy on Jews as well. This is just the game that was played.
Yeah, and of course the famous historian of the Jewish War was Josephus, who was a Jewish scholar who basically joined the Romans.
Yeah,
and was he was Vespasian's official historian of the Jewish War. So there were quite a few Jews that were, you could say, they became Hellenized Jews.
Yeah, and
this was the thing. Yeah, this was the difference. Whereas the Jews that weren't Hellenized were very strict. The 10 Commandments: "Thou shalt not have any other gods before thee," and the images of the emperor were an abomination. And of course, the abomination of desolation is to put the image of the emperor or another god in the temple in Jerusalem, right? which is kind of what I think is what Antiochus the Great attempted to do, which caused the Maccabean rebellion against Antiochus, who was the Greek ruler of Syria, a descendant of one of Alexander the Great's generals who had conquered that part of the world. So this history of the Jews' struggle to exist and maintain their traditions and their belief in one God. This goes back.
And so after the Romans had sent their legions, to destroy the Jews, a lot of them had to escape, and they try to find a new home in various places. And obviously, Jews had to protect themselves. And the Jews had, of course, they had to develop, some intelligence capabilities of their own. But when you don't have a country, for the next, 2,000 plus years, when you don't have a country, your options are very limited in terms of intelligence. Okay, this is an absolutely key point, I believe, because at a later stage.
When you're a stateless person, what are your rights? You're stuck in a ghetto. You're ghettoized, right? And you're also separated, and
you cannot create false identities. You cannot create false papers for people or any sort of standard procedure that is normal to a country, right? And so Jews were at a clear disadvantage. Now, they had some things they could use because, in a Jewish community, these people know each other. They're very close. So you have your own kind of language and coded language, and you had your own code system. So there was some stuff you could do, but it was very limited by the fact that you didn't have a country. And this is very important because, in the modern era, this mythology was created that centered around almost magical abilities of the Jews in terms of intelligence. So everybody else was stupid, but the Jews could create intelligence miracles, and with the Rothschilds and everything. And so, of course, when this mythology was created, this was then retroactively tied to historical interpretations. So it was claimed that Jews destroyed the Roman Empire, and Jews destroyed the French Empire, and then Jews destroyed the Russian Tsarist Empire, and Jews kind of took over the British Empire, with the Rothschilds. So intelligence miracles. Oh, and by the way, then they did this miracle again when the Jews supposedly took over, America, the United States. So it's again and again and again, it's this notion of intelligence miracles while everybody else is just stupid. But the Jews did not have a country for a very long time, so they could not do whatever every serious country was able to do.
The Jews had something in common. This is what Hannah Arendt points out. They had something in common with the aristocracy of Europe. The aristocracy of Europe was educated. The Jews valued education. The aristocracy of Europe, as educated, learned Latin, the language common to all of European countries, and the Jews had Hebrew. And these two groups found the aristocrats found the Jews useful. The Jews could be intermediaries and diplomats, but also spies. And of course, the Jews were allowed to loan money at interest because the Catholic Church basically forbade Christians from loaning money at interest. And so this became something that the Jews were able to develop amongst themselves. And of course, the anti-Semitism of the Catholic Church, there was this interpretation that the Jews were the killers of Christ. They not only rejected Christ, but in the book of Matthew, it says, the Jews tell Pilate, let it be on the heads of ourselves and our children. Okay, so this scripture was used by anti-Semites within the Catholic Church and within Europe to further demonize the Jews and to isolate them. And in fact, it's still being done.
Yeah.
This scholar, E. Michael Jones, wrote this book. I do not recommend it. I got it for research purposes. He's a very learned man, but he is very twisted. This is E. Michael Jones, The Jewish Revolutionary Spirit, in which Jones basically makes the case that the Jews are behind all the evil, all the
Yeah.
revolutions of modernity are
Yeah.
basically Jewish, is his
Yeah.
claim.
And
And of
also,
course, it's very clever, but it's very twisted, and it's not
yeah, and
true. I mean, sure, Jews were involved in things because Jews were used as spies,
yeah,
and
and there's
Jews were
even
being manipulated by powerful interests.
and there's I think there's even a I quoted this a long time ago. There's even a somebody did a report for the CIA talking about espionage in the ancient world, and they talked about Jesus and how the empire spied on Jesus because they were always looking for potential movements and uprisings and people who didn't like the multi-god setup that the Romans were using. So they had eyes and ears everywhere. So when Jesus came along, people spied on him, and you can see some of the traces, of course, in the Bible, but you have to understand, the historical context of that era. So there was this one incident where people were sort of interrogating Jesus and said, "Well, are you saying we shouldn't pay our taxes?" And of course the answer was, pay your taxes. I'm not saying people shouldn't pay their
Render
taxes.
unto Caesar the things
Yeah.
that are Caesar, and
Yeah,
unto God the things that are God's.
in
Yes.
this intelligence interpretation, which I share, by the way, in this intelligence interpretation, this was sort of an attempt at entrapment. They were trying to get an illegal statement out of Jesus because he could have been arrested pretty much on the spot if he had said,
or manipulated or blackmailed or
recruited,
anything like that. Yeah.
recruited or anything, because if he had said that, don't pay taxes, this would have been one of the worst crimes in the Roman realm you could imagine. So and there's another element to this when when we come to the point of Judas Judas contacting the authorities. Now, most Bibles that you get are based on a Greek text. Now, of course, Greek was not the language of Jesus, obviously. And so one of the words used in the Greek text, is the word paradidonai. Now, there are various ways you can translate that, and one way to translate that is to betray. But the other translation says to hand someone over. And now some historians have looked at this, and they think that this group around Jesus, they all knew that the authorities were coming. The pressure was becoming crazy, so an arrest was going to happen anyway. And so the instruction was, historians think the instruction was, we need someone in the group. So this is actually Jesus talking. I need somebody in this group to hand me over to the authorities to protect, the rest of the group. So it becomes a matter of, translation when you look at that sort of betrayal that became the foundation of, the foundation of anti-Semitism for so long. And that lasted until, let's say, the early 1800s. And it was only in the early 1800s that, anti-Semitism was brought to the next level. That's how long the old phase actually lasted. And so you had, because you spoke about the aristocrats, you had the so-called court Jews, and they were used by the aristocracy, and they were controlled by the aristocracy, because the aristocracy was not stupid. They were running empires. They knew intelligence. They were not buffoons who would, be buffoons who would be totally scammed by the Jews and all that nonsense. Very professional people here.
Yeah, and the thing is we mentioned this before, that homosexuals and Jews were used as agents in the Middle Ages for certain reason, because spying is a business that Christians were not supposed to become involved with. It was and the Jews had the advantage that there were Jewish communities everywhere, so that Jews could move freely into these different areas and not be suspected, and had a lot of important ties to these aristocratic families. So whereas homosexuals could be used to compromise people. And in fact, it comes even to modern times, where you'll have some historians of MI6 will say that more than 100 years ago, MI6 preferred to hire homosexuals or bisexuals as operatives. In other words, James Bond was gay, right? I mean, that's the, and then this is where we get to this modern Middle East thing with World War I. We should, because we've used up a lot of time on the background now, we need to play catch up. And of course, I mentioned before how the British and the Allies, the French, were moving into the Middle East. The British invaded Iraq, as well as the other Arab countries, Lebanon and Palestine, the Holy Land. And what ended up happening in this is that the Turks lost the war, and their empire collapsed. And as one of the central powers, like Austria, Hungary collapsed in Germany, the Allies were victorious, and they made the disposition in the Middle East. But there was a curious agent of the MI6 who also worked for the British State Department at times, and his name was Jack Philby.
Uh-oh.
You might remember the name. Jack Philby was Kim Philby's father. Kim Philby, the famous British
Soviet
traitor, the Cambridge moles. Philby, who defected to Russia and wrote his famous memoir about how he fooled everybody, and was a Soviet agent the whole time. Kim Philby, who was slated to become the head of MI5, and who was bisexual or homosexual, and his father was also sexually, fluid, let's say. Different. Now, he started out, now how Kim Philby got his name was that his dad was working for the British Civil Service in India when he made the mistake of handcuffing a higher level Indian to an untouchable, which was a no-no. That was violating the local customs. He got kicked out of the British Civil Service, and he developed a hatred of Great Britain for that, a hatred of the British establishment, and he joined MI6. Mm-hmm. Well, because he was sexually fluid. He had been to Cambridge, like his son went to Cambridge. And so then they moved him to the Middle East. And Jack Philby turns out to be one of the formative personalities of the modern Middle East, along with King Ibn Saud, his close friend, who he helped to make the king of Saudi Arabia, Jack Philby did, and also Alan Dulles, who Jack Philby befriended. And of course, there's this rumor that Alan Dulles was recruited like Wild Bill Donovan by the British during World War I and became a British agent working for the American intelligence. And Alan Dulles was a womanizer who, according to stories in the intelligence world, there's all these stories, but no one can verify them, that Alan Dulles fell into an Austrian honey trap right as soon as he comes to Switzerland in World War I, and becomes now a triple agent working for the British, the Austrians, and the Americans. And of course, I think the British get him out of that trouble because they're able to then catch that, the honey trap operation, and turn it back on the Austrians. So they got Dulles out of trouble, which earned Dulles the undying loyalty to the British, of course. But here's Dulles in the Middle East, and he's perfectly willing to betray the British because Jack Philby hates the British. The British want to put their own puppets in all over Arabia, but Jack Philby's going to spite his own country and make sure that different people get put in to these countries like Jordan and Saudi, or what becomes Saudi Arabia, and so on, and thwart the British plan of dominance in the Middle East. And of course, why the British want the Middle East is they're beginning to discover oil, especially after 1920. They discover oil. Of course, they discovered oil in Persia. They discovered oil in the Arab, around the Persian Gulf. And of course, Jack Philby knows this. He wants, and so he starts to work against the MI6, his own service, leaking information to Ibn Saud, enabling the local Arabs, and he converts to Islam himself. And of course, he makes all these arrangements with Dulles, who becomes the State Department's guy in the Middle East in the 1920s, to give the oil, make sure the oil concessions in Saudi Arabia don't go to the British, but go to Standard Oil of California, which of course America's recognized as Chevron, but also is Aramco, the Arabian American Oil Company.
Yeah, and the Rockefellers, right? Yeah, the Rockefellers, they loved the British monarchy, and some of the Rockefellers, they had an intelligence function for some time, especially World War II and everything. So yeah, they even bought some historical, very valuable furniture. So the Rockefellers buying this antique furniture from the British monarchs, actually.
Yeah, of course, they cut the British out of all this oil by doing this. And of course, what's interesting is that the Allen Dulles, who ultimately becomes the head of the CIA after Walter Bedell Smith is suspected of being a Soviet agent. And of course, Allen Dulles is his deputy. How did he get his deputy? Well, Smith picked him. Why they didn't think the guy who picked him is suspicious, the guy they picked is suspicious. Dulles ends up in this relationship with Philby in the Middle East in the 1920s, helping to form this and to bring the Americans in to this whole equation. And of course, oil becomes, there is then competition then between the British and the Americans in the Middle East over the oil. And Philby is the fly in the ointment. He gets kicked out of MI5. They realize that he's been working against them, that he is converted to Islam, that he's really the agent of King Saud and the Americans. And they basically kick him out of MI6. So that is, but the story doesn't end there, because you have the Nazis emerging, of course, as you know, in Germany, and they're interested in the Middle East too. And they form an alliance with the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem and the Muslim Brotherhood. They find a lot in common with the Nazis, and Hitler just loves the Muslim Brotherhood. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that.
Muslim units, actually. I mean, the Nazis, they had some Muslim units.
Yeah. Yeah, in fact, yeah, because they conquered Yugoslavia, and the Bosnians were Muslims, and of course, this is a very interesting. So you have this complicated spy game where you have the Nazis, you have the Soviet Union, and I should mention that Lenin, the second speech Lenin gave after the Bolsheviks took power was to the Muslims of the Russian Empire and beyond, saying that you are, Muslims, you should not feel threatened by communism. You are our natural ally against capitalism, that you have the same enemy that we do, which is Western imperialism. And remember, Lenin's innovation as a Marxist theorist was that the final stage of capitalism was imperialism, was the colonizing of all these countries, Western colonialism, and that these were the oppressed people of the underdeveloped world. We later developed that term. And of course, that capitalism was sucking them dry, that they were the larger proletariat of the poor countries, which we hear this all the time now. But this is very much Lenin. And so Lenin sends his agents out, not just to Soviet Central Asia, which is Muslim, which was part of the Russian Empire, but to the Middle East, to these red sheikhs, they ultimately are called, in the Middle East, so that there's a lot of communist influence in the Arab world. They begin burrowing in, and of course the Nazis start doing the same thing. Even before Hitler comes to power, they're developing these relationships with the Muslims in the Middle East.
Then the 1920s became sort of the perfect storm. The perfect storm, with anti-Semitism, because almost everybody started to do it, and it became, or it got a huge traction in the Muslim world, because
it was popular on Wall Street
because of the Russian influence. So this was spreading in the United States. Then it was spreading in Britain. It was spreading in Germany. The Bolsheviks, they spread it in the Muslim world more and more, even in the 20s. This was not only
and Henry Ford, very famously, Henry Ford of the Ford Motor published the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in the Dearborn Observer.
And I kid you not, even the exiled Romanovs did that crap. Now, of course, the protocols, the fake protocols of Zion, they came out of Tsarist Russia. Now, this was Sergei Nilus came up with this, or some of these people close to him, they came up with this text. It got popular in Tsarist Russia, but then when the surviving Romanovs were in exile, and there was quite a few of them, these Romanovs kept doing this for some crazy reason. So the Romanovs actually played a significant role, because they were trying to dominate anti-communism. Now, I always say anti-communism is based on counterintelligence and the quest for liberty. Anti-communism is not fascism. It's not traditional conspiracy mythology, right? But the Romanovs, they tried to create this international crazy movement, like an the mirror image of the Comintern. They created the anti-Comintern. So the Romanovs, they still had some money left that was not eaten up by World War I, some money that was not taken by the communists. So they still had some money in Britain and in stocks, and the Romanovs also had a significant connection to Henry Ford. So Romanovs were working in all kinds of countries to create movements and infiltrate movements, start movements. So they were doing this in France, spreading the Protocols of Zion. They were doing this in Germany. The Romanovs even gave money to fascists in Germany. They were giving money to Hindenburg. They were giving money to the extreme right wing. And there's some, we can maybe get into this later a bit. The Romanovs, they even had some serious connections to Americans, anti-communist Americans. There were all these groups with former generals and retired intelligence people and all that. So the Romanovs are pushing this garbage as well, even though
and it's polluting the anti-communist movement, because it's very funny, because the communists themselves start using this anti-Semitism in their operations, and of course the communists are very keen on infiltrating the Tsarist groups, the white groups, the white Russian diaspora. They're very keen on infiltrating it. They're very keen on corrupting it. And of course, the communists want to say that this awful, obnoxious anti-Semitism is what anti-communism is. Yeah. They want to identify it as, so when a lot of people hear anti-communism, they hear anti-Semite, which is not, the two things are not the same.
Yeah.
And yet, because of this propaganda, people get this idea.
So like my ancestor, he just didn't check on the information that was given to him, right? This was everywhere in Germany, of course. So he read it, he believed it. So he didn't check if this check if this was true. But it's different with the Romanovs. So it's unforgivable, I think.
Well, they knew better. Yeah. Nicholas had the Protocols investigated and discovered that it was a forgery.
Yeah, and so it's not even a good forgery.
Knew.
Yeah, it's not even a good forgery. Good forgery is very specifically made. It's tailored to a professional audience, and it spills some secrets, to make the whole thing sort of believable. So you have to expose some assets, you have to expose some operations, and that's what you do with a good forgery. But the protocols are just vapid. They're just stupid. They plagiarize some older texts. They don't reveal any specific asset. They don't reveal any specific operation. There's really nothing
There's
in
no
it. And
specific real knowledge in it
Yeah.
at all. It's just an invention.
It's just regurgitating what was already in, you know, the literature for many, many decades. Not just in the right wing, not just in Europe. This was even the early socialist movement in France. They already did that in the 1920s and the 1930s, you know, with the Rothschilds, and they're going to take everything over. It was that old, right? So it was somebody put together these protocols, and even just the name, the Protocols of Zion, even that is just a stupid gimmick, because they have these chapters in there and they call them the protocols, but they're not structured in a chronological fashion or really structured about topics. It's just everything thrown together. It's that bad, right?
Well, yeah, and it's based on it's interesting. The idea is that there's this one evil group in the world that accounts for all the bad things that have happened. And that if we could just understand, if we could just get rid of, so some of these anti-Semitic arguments are like, if we could just get rid of the Jews, there'll be fewer wars, because they're starting these wars and they're doing it to loan money at interest to military power. I mean, you run into these kind of arguments, and of course it's just horrific. But simple-minded people who don't know a lot of history can gravitate towards it because, I can kind of see it. And you throw out a few Jewish names in there, they're convinced, you know?
Yeah, and it's like when the protocols came out and when they spread, these protocols could only convince people in combination with other fakes and hoaxes. So, the famous Rothschild fairy tales. If you didn't have those Rothschild fairy tales, the protocols wouldn't have worked. And so, of course, how this feeds into the Middle East is that Jack Philby and King Ibn Saud, they see this rising Jewish community in Israel with more people pouring in Palestine, with more Jews coming into Palestine. And of course there's the Balfour Declaration, which wasn't really, it was just an empty British promise. Yeah.
But you have the British State Department. I think it was 1920. They appointed a Jewish guy to head the British Foreign Office. It's not called the State Department. It's the U.S. is the State Department. The British is the Foreign Office. And the Foreign Office was very pro-Jewish state, whereas MI6 was not.
Mm-hmm.
MI6, there was a lot of anti-Semitism in MI6, and so suddenly you had Ibn Saud and his friend Jack Philby are looking at the possibility that the British Foreign Office is going to promote a Jewish state in Palestine. And of course, the British are in charge of Palestine at this point. So how do they
thwart
it? The larger
Palestine area, not today.
Right, the larger Palestine area, which includes today Jordan, right? Because there really is two states now. People say the two-state solution. Well, Jordan and Israel are the two states, right?
Yeah. And even Winston Churchill talked about Zionism early. This was, I think, the early 1920s. And he talked about it in the worst possible way. He had this commentary that was published in a large newspaper, and it was something like Zionism versus Bolshevism, the struggle for the Jewish soul, or something like that. And in this text, he makes this distinction between the good Jews and the bad Jews. Now, the bad Jews, of course, for him, were the Bolsheviks, and the good Jews, those were the Zionists. And he also made this kind of woozy promise, maybe we'll get the good Jews, a home in the Palestine region. He wasn't specific. Is it going to be a state? Is it going to be large? Is it going to be tiny? So, and he talked about Zionism, and then he talked about Bolshevism, of course, and he was creating this just maniacal connection with the conspiracy literature at the time. He was name dropping Nesta Webster, and he was saying that this nefarious Bolshevism, he said Bolshevism was Jewish, and he said this was a conspiracy that is as old as, he meant the Illuminati. He called it the old days of Spartacus Weishaupt. Now, of course, this means Adam Weishaupt and his codename Spartacus. He means the Bavarian Order of the Illuminati. So he was saying that, you know, Bolshevism was Jewish, and, you know, this conspiracy goes back a long time.
Well, it was in that moment when Churchill, a lot of people before the London Times published the facts about, you know, somebody recognized the protocols as being partly cribbed from Joly's book, Conversations of Machiavelli and Montesquieu in Hell. And so Churchill was briefly taken in by the protocols, it seems. And of course, Churchill ended up being very pro-Israel, very pro-Jewish and Zionist later on. But like many people who were anti-communist, they ended up believing some of this Tsarist white Russian protocols nonsense that was spreading not only in Germany but in Britain. But because the London Times brought out the falseness of the protocols in the English-speaking world, unlike in Germany, informed British people realized that the protocols were fake. Yeah. And that never came across in Germany.
So even before, like, what was it, like roughly 3 decades before there was a state of Israel, which is tiny, of course. Even before that, you know, Churchill was already co-creating that problem for this future state of Israel by, you know, making all these sort of claims. And Churchill, he could have just asked the king or some of the other people from the monarchy. He could have just asked them and you know, and just pose the question. So is this Jewish conspiracy real? Do the Rothschilds really control Britain? And the honest answer would have been absolutely, this is absolute garbage. You know,
it's crazy.
First of all, the House of Hessen, you know, the noble House of Hessen had initially recruited Meyer Amschel Rothschild, the first, you know, famous known, you know, Rothschild. It was the House of Hessen that recruited the guy, made him work to hide money and assets from Napoleon. And then Rothschild was handed, and especially with his sons then, Rothschild was handed over to the British Crown to, you know, move money to the troops.
And of course, anti-Semitism was the British aristocracy had its own anti-Semitism. And of course, same thing with the Americans. And when the Balfour Declaration was made, one of the reasons given in the British cabinet was that the Jews own the American press, and we want the Americans fully committed to the war. We want the Americans in the war, and if we do this, then the Jewish press in America, well, of course, it's nonsense. The press in America was not Jewish during World War I. There were maybe 2 press, newspaper owners that were Jewish, and they made up a tiny percentage of the American press. The American press was not Jewish owned, but people had these ideas about America. They had these ideas, of course, the Nazis had these ideas about the Jewish influence in Great Britain. I mean, Hitler thought that the Jews, because of the Rothschilds, they really had colonized Britain and the United States, you know, which is one of these myths that anti-Semites believe.
And it's even more stupid with the Romanovs, you know, the exiled Romanovs, because they were themselves the House of Hessen and Schleswig-Holstein. They could have asked their freaking relatives, is this true? Is the Jewish conspiracy real? Do the Rothschilds control Britain? And the answer would have been no, of course not. That's total nonsense.
In fact, by the way, if you read, there's a wonderful little book, and it's written by an American diplomat who is Jewish. It's called A Red Star Over Bethlehem, Ira Hirschman. And he goes into this, and he explains, you know, during the period of anti-Semitism, the people who got rich through the Nazi period were not Jews. The Rothschilds became insignificant as a banking family during this period. They lost money. They shrank relative to the other money powers. And what's really ironic, and Hirschman points this out, is that a lot of these Nazi financiers, both those who financed on Wall Street in America and those who were in Germany who actually were released from prison after the war, who'd collaborated with Hitler, they got richer than anything after the war.
Yeah.
So that after the war, the Nazis had more money. The people who had been Nazis had more money than the Jews.
And
right?
the Rothschilds were not even the only bankers that were recruited by the aristocracy. You had the famous Barings Bank, in England. And the Baring family, we call them Baring, they were from Hanover, which is like the birthplace of, the modern British kings, right? And also when Israel, or a state of Israel was becoming a distinct possibility, there was another very crazy thing going on that many people don't really understand, and it's key to this, I think. And this is when the Holocaust was happening, many Jewish people wanted to escape from Europe, and one possible place to escape to was the Greater Palestine region controlled by the Brits, right? But the Brits, they had sort of this arrangement with the Arab kingdoms, and the Arab kingdoms were saying, we don't want a lot of Jews.
Well, it was
here.
Jack Philby, by the way, went to war and with the British Foreign Office to prevent the Jews from coming, because he was working with, of course, the Saudi king, and they worked this deal, and Dulles was supposedly part of this too, if you believe John Loftus's account, that they were blocking Jewish immigration to the Middle East, which, by the way, Hitler's original plan was to get all the Jews out of Germany and put them into the Middle East, right? That was originally the plan before he decided, well, let's take them hostage and put a gun to their head and kill them all if the war doesn't go our way. Hitler, was the origin of the Holocaust. Yeah. And of course, these murderous plans of Hitler, and it's very funny that the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Jack, the Muslim Brotherhood, Jack Philby, they all ended up working with Hitler in another way. They blocked the Jews coming in, but then they were trying to increase Nazi influence. And of course, when Rommel was coming across the desert, invading Egypt, Nasser, who we'll hear about in a few minutes, and Sadat were Egyptian army officers plotting to join Rommel, right, if he arrived in Cairo. Yeah. And of course, the Nazis had plans. There was a Nazi revolution, by the way, in Iraq. And Saddam Hussein's uncle was one of the guys that helped this Nazi regime briefly. Of course, the British invaded Iraq and deposed this Nazi regime in Iraq. So there was this incredible enthusiasm in the Arab world for Nazism, which is
and also when
interesting.
When the Holocaust was happening, Jews tried Jews tried all this diplomacy, with Britain, and they used all kinds of people in Britain that had connections to the government and the throne and everything. So they tried this diplomacy to make Britain, to make the British leadership change their minds, but that didn't work that well. And then you had some Jewish settlers in the Palestine region. They did a bit of terrorism, to put some more pressure on the British out of sheer desperation. And also you had these groups like, for example, this is a group that is misrepresented a lot, right? And this is the Chabad group, okay? So many people, they confuse Chabad with this mythological, elders of Zion crap, but it's totally different. It's totally different things. And so there was a robust Chabad movement in the Soviet Union, and what they tried to do was to protect Jewish life. And they used sort of this, what they call soft diplomacy, because the KGB always knew everything about them. And there's many records that, document this. So Jews tried this and that in the Soviet Union, to have underground Jewish schools and to have, so they can do the rituals and have Jewish life. But the KGB always knew everything about them because they had infiltrated Chabad. They had spies everywhere. But this Chabad movement was sort of left alive because the KGB thought, well, maybe we could use them for espionage purposes, internationally. So this is like the only reason it survived in the Soviet Union. And people to this day, they confuse Chabad with, the Elders of Zion and get it all wrong. So this was sort of the tool set of Jewish people. They always tried this diplomacy, to protect Jewish people. And this is sort of what was going on before the state of Israel even happened. And of course, in the 20th century, creating a new state is a monumental task, and it's you always get a huge problem with infiltration, because if you have a Jewish person with these roots and those roots, how can you trust this person not to be a KGB agent? How can you trust the British, some of the British people who helped create Israel, because Britain was so infiltrated by Soviet intelligence? It's a nightmare. And so this became a mess, and it's really, really hard to untangle this mess and try to understand who was ultimately working for what side when it came to this very, very tiny state of Israel. Because your microphone is off.
The formation of the state of Israel. Let's. There's a very important details we don't understand. Like you say, it's very foggy. There's something in World War II that I don't remember if we touched on it. It's called the Max Network, and it was a network of Jews in Romania, in that part of Europe, but it extended back into the Soviet Union, and they claimed to represent monarchist white Russian holdovers that were still in the top of the Soviet army, and that they wanted to feed information to the German general staff so Germany could win the war and liberate the Soviet Union from communism, supposedly. And of course, this particular Jewish operative, I believe he was a Romanian Jew, sold this idea to the German military intelligence, to the Abwehr, Admiral Canaris, and of course Reinhard Gehlen, who was in charge of Foreign Armies East. He was in charge of spying on the Soviet Union for the German military. They bought into it, and of course, when Hitler heard about this Jewish network of spies, the German general said, "Look, we keep them out of the concentration camp. We allow them to be free, and they provide us, in exchange, they provide us with their information from these conservative white Russians," as if Jews would be working for white Russians at the heart of the Soviet military. It's so preposterous, but they were desperate to believe they had this source. And Hitler said, "No, don't have anything to do with them." But the German generals didn't take Hitler's, advice, or if it was an order, they didn't follow it. They kept feeding on this information, and it was such a brilliant deception because they fed really good information. The Soviet operation intelligence fed really good information that caused whole Soviet armies at times to be destroyed, which really convinced it, sold it to the German generals. But what they did is they set up this trap at Stalingrad, where they convinced the German generals that the Russians were out of troops. There was nothing more beyond the Volga, that the German army, and that made the Germans feel safe to over-concentrate Sixth Army, to have their dispositions completely wrong for defense. And meanwhile, the Russians had this vast number of divisions closing in on the area, ready to cross the Don and come out from behind the Volga and to strike Sixth Army in the flanks. And of course, this trap was the first great victory of the Russians first real victory of the Soviets or Russians in World War II. And of course, the Max network allowed it. But that somehow they were able to explain that away to the German generals. So the Max network was still believed in after Stalingrad. So they set them up again at Kursk, and they set them up again before the destruction of Army Group Center by making them to believe that the Soviet offensive would come for the Romanian oil in the summer of 44. So this Max network was extremely effective long-range deception, and it relied on that same old idea that there were czarists, whites still in the Soviet system that were embedded in it, that were able to work with people outside of the Soviet Union. Again, they swallowed this nonsense. It's this thing is still, as you pointed out last week, this sort of thing is being sold over and over again as a story to Westerners. And if they only realize this is just one repeat trick, this is a favorite trick pony of Russian intelligence. But this Max network got the attention of Alan Dulles, who was working for the OSS in Switzerland during World War II, and he wanted the Max intelligence because he thought it would be a coup if he could get intelligence for the Americans out of Moscow, what the Russians were really up to. And of course, this is where he got ensnared, because Dulles was a corrupt character, Alan Dulles, by all accounts, even by the account of his protege, James Angleton, who, when he was dying of cancer, told Joseph Treno that Dulles was corrupt, that he had made these deals with the Nazis. Well, a lot of the Nazis, Dulles was negotiating with Walter Schellenberg towards the end of the war, the head of SS Foreign Intelligence. Schellenberg wanted a separate peace. He was urging Himmler to take over, to, Hitler's sick, get rid of him. You become the head, you negotiate the peace, you prevent. And Schellenberg was one of these Nazis that wanted the Allies to win the war, whereas people like Martin Bormann and Heinrich Müller wanted the Soviets to get the lion's share of Germany after the war. So you had this civil war in the Third Reich between these elements, and Alan Dulles gets captured, and he ends up taking Nazi gold for helping Nazis escape. And of course, you have the rat line through the Vatican, but really what was going on there was that the Vatican was interested in saving Croatian Catholics who were being, fell afoul, of course, of the communists under Tito, because the Soviet armies reached there first, and Tito got better support than and then you have the Ustashi fascists, right? And of course, you have the Catholic churches trying to save Catholics, not being too discriminating about some of these people committed atrocities. Some of these people were with the Nazis. So you end up having these Croatian fascists ending up coming to America through this thing, and of course end up being used by Richard Nixon and conservatives in America to rally against communists and against the Democratic Party to get out the Republican vote, in the 1950s. Yeah. And so then you have this, just like the whites are bringing the protocols in and this bad ideology into anti-communism generally, you have this poisoning. And of course, the communists have infiltrated the Ustashi just like they infiltrated the Nazis. So there, you can't tell which one of these Croatian fascists is really a communist agent being sent over. And at the same time, see, they're dirtying up the Vatican. They're dirtying up people like Alan Dulles. And of course, it was, they say that in terms of this, the rat line, Angleton was not directly involved. He ran messages. He was kind of aware of what was going on. And probably later what he told Treno was that Dulles and his friends compromised themselves, and the Soviets had to have known and had to have used it against them later. So, and this becomes important in the Middle East because in the 1950s, when the Middle East thing starts to heat up after the formation of the State of Israel in 1948, on May 14th, 1948, you have this problem. Whereas the Alan Dulles and his brother They were New York lawyers with connections to Wall Street, and of course that Standard Oil money, that Aramco money, was something they all were being enriched by. Right, the investment in Saudi Arabia was giving great returns, and the American establishment had good reasons to protect it. So America, to even though Truman recognized Israel, I think on the day that it formed,
The Soviets did, right?
and the
Immediately.
Soviets did maybe even before, even hours before, Stalin was quick to recognize Israel because he hoped Israel would be a socialist state aligned with the Soviet Union. But the Americans really had these tremendous relationships, especially in Saudi Arabia, with the Arabs. And the Americans had the hopes that the Arab world, because America was, got our revolution from Britain, the Americans kind of wanted to see the British and French colonialism come to an end. Then America would be in charge of this Middle East oil and be friends with the Arabs. And so we had this dream, which was the Dulles brothers. Allen Dulles' brother was John Foster Dulles, who was, through most of the two terms of Eisenhower, was Secretary of State. Very strong anti-communist, but really not really pro-Israel, though they would give lip service to Israel. They knew that our economic interest, was with the Arabs because of the oil in Saudi Arabia. And this is something people have to understand, that America is not some Zionist puppet. We did not have anything to do with Israel forming as a state. We didn't give them money or weapons. In fact, the Israelis beat this Arab Legion that Jack Philby had been instrumental in forming through his contacts in Britain. There were British military advisors helping some of these. And of course, Britain was dead set against, because Palestine was its colony. They didn't want a Jewish state or an Arab state in Palestine. But as this fighting, this hatred between the Jews and Arabs was fed, it was the Soviets, though, that really liked the idea of this conflict between Jews and Arabs, because they could use this to put American politicians into this dilemma where American politicians could not be anti-Jewish because of the Jewish vote and because of the perceptions of many Christians, especially evangelical Christians, really like the idea of a Jewish state and were pro-Israel, and they even described themselves as Zionists. So you couldn't. This was embarrassing, but they knew that the real interests, the financial interests of Americans, were with the Arabs, with the oil. So you see, the Soviet Union was just gleeful with, oh, look at this, we can put the Americans on the horns of this dilemma between their Arab friends and their Jewish friends and force them to choose, right?
Yeah.
And so this, in the meantime, you have a revolution in Egypt where a bunch of Egyptian colonels, Nasser being the leader of them, takes over Egypt. And Nasser becomes president of Egypt.
Yeah, and then of course, Lord Louis Mountbatten, he tried his hardest to screw up the whole Egypt thing, and he was he became very suspicious to many people and intelligence professionals in different countries. Lord Louis Mountbatten, obviously with the British royal family, and he's also the House of Hessen, like the Romanovs. And it's like the KGB did this thing where they would talk to Jewish people, and they would talk to Jewish people and say, look, we Russians, we made all these great sacrifices to defeat the Nazis. We had the highest body count and everything. And so, and look at these Western countries, there was so much fascism in those countries, the collaborators and the appeasers, the British and the French and everybody. And, the Americans were doing some early business with the Nazis in the 30s. So look at all this fascism. So now we, the Soviet Union, are the alternative. We're the nice guys. We're the good guys. And we can help, Jewish people. So please work for us. Let us recruit you, sign here, and sign your first payment as a spy. So they did this all the time, and it worked many times, with Klaus Fuchs, the German Jewish atomic scientist who went to Britain, I think he was even attached to the Tube Alloys project. Then the British, they handed him over to the Americans to work on the Manhattan Project, and he spied on everything. And the Rosenbergs and others. So this was always kind of the game plan of the KGB. So this was like this untapped potential, for Soviet espionage to talk to Jews, because Jews for the most part lived in the United States and Canada, some in Britain, of course, Middle East, obviously. And so this was like an opportunity for the Soviets to try to,
and it's a double game for them, because they could promote Jews as their instruments, and then they could, with their infiltration of the anti-Semitic white Russian movement, they could then make them go crazy over it, and everybody would lose the ideological context of Marxism-Leninism in the midst of it.
Yeah, and also within the Soviet Union, they had a lot of opportunities to prepare operations, using Jews and using others. This is what I mentioned earlier in the show. When you have a country, an empire, a safe territory, you can prep agents, train agents, prepare larger operations. And Jewish people, they never had an empire. And for the longest time, they didn't even have a state, a safe ground, to be used for intelligence purposes. So when the Soviet Union, they could try all kinds of things. So it's known that the KGB even created phony identities, phony Jewish backgrounds. And also, when Jews lived in Russia for a long time, there was, some people, different people married each other. So at some point, you had people that were part Jewish, part European, and part Slavic. When you see some of these, when you see some people, it's hard to tell by the looks of them. Are they Russian, Slavic? Are they Jewish, right? And so the Soviets, they use that for their own advantage. So when you hear about, somebody in Israel doing this, or some oligarch in Israel doing that, or some modern day oligarch in Russia, some supposed Jewish oligarch in Russia, you never know what this person really is.
Well, it's a major strategy in the creation of the oligarchs by the KGB and the Communist Party Soviet Union to choose Jews. This is a real strategic choice, because then they can leverage the anti-Semitism, because they were planning to use the far right and far left in their strategy, long-range strategy, for a future convergence. And so anti-Semitism has this vital role to play in that. And by making Jewish oligarchs, and of course they don't like capitalism in the KGB or now the FSB, and they don't really want it to succeed, and they want it to have a bad name, and they also want to be able to have influence in Israel. And that's another thing that going back to the Max network, that was a Soviet Jewish network feeding the German general staff. As absurd as that sounds, the Max network, many of those Jews in the network, and by the way, the same thing with the Red Orchestra, all the Jews in there, Stalin started to liquidate the Jews, many of his Jewish agents. Many did not survive. And I think it was because of the Holocaust. Many of these Soviet agents of the Jews, they changed their allegiance to a new country they wanted to form in the Middle East, in Palestine. They wanted in Israel. So suddenly, Stalin started distrusting some of his Jewish agents, started liquidating some of them. And what happened with this group, because they got connected to Dulles, they basically got Dulles and the OSS. They said, oh, you're taking Nazi gold, and you're smuggling Nazis out to Argentina, but we need you to smuggle Jews to the Middle East, because the British were, favoring the Arabs, were blocking Jewish immigration to Palestine. And this was very famous. The British didn't want this large number, because you had all these Jews released from concentration camps and in Europe, because Hitler had gathered up all these Jews of which he did not exterminate all of them. We don't know the exact number, but there were, I don't know, 10 million Jews in Europe,
I don't
and
remember exactly.
so there are millions that then could go to Israel, or at least a million or two that could go to Israel. And of course, the British didn't want that. And of course, the Jews in Europe, why would they want to stay after they'd been persecuted, robbed, had their business stolen, and then were massacred in these death camps and forced to work in labor camps? They'd take the healthier ones to work, and the children and the old people, and they just exterminate those. So it seems that so they wanted to move Jews and other things. So it seems that Dulles got compromised, and there is the story, the claim, and Loftus makes a claim that Angleton helped the Jews move people to Israel. And this is how Angleton became a very important person. He was the liaison with Israel for the CIA for years. He had the Israel account, they called it, which is interesting. And so he was always this friend of Israel, this helper of the Israelis. And the other thing is, de Gaulle, to spite the British, because he was so angry at many of the things the British and also the Americans had done, he also facilitated with French ships moving Jews into Palestine, smuggling them in large numbers to bolster this, to create this new state, to create this population in Israel. So this was the complicated. Meanwhile, of course, the Arab Legion is formed. There's these Arab armies going to crush Israel in 1948, and of course they fail. Even though the Jews have no heavy weapons, they defeat these two armies with their British advisors, and of course the state of Israel is formed. Now then you have the revolution in Egypt, and why that is important. The Soviets have their agents, and no doubt the Soviets penetrated the Jewish state, and they penetrated it at its intelligence services almost certainly. So because the Soviets are so good at that, and they had their Jewish agents. How loyal were these Jewish agents? Because you had Jewish intelligence was made up of former Soviet and former Western intelligence people, had come together to form it. Were they all loyal to Israel? Maybe there were spies in there. It's, when you think about a people that's persecuted to extermination, where there's this genocide against them, maybe they all were loyal to Israel, and they were able to, maybe there was a purity of purpose there. I don't know. It's very hard to tell. But the state of Israel Stalin became unhappy with it. He thought, well, the Arabs are more numerous. Let's stick with Lenin's idea of using the Arabs. But they had no easy way in. They'd infiltrated, of course. But the Arabs, as Hirschman points out, you can't buy an Arab, you can only rent him. This is the joke in intelligence circles. You buy an Arab, he doesn't, you bribe him, he doesn't stay bribed. So there was this revolution in Egypt, and Nasser immediately started to ask Eisenhower for weapons when Eisenhower was president. Give us weapons, arm Egypt. And Eisenhower and John Foster Dulles, they were thinking, well, if we give you weapons, you're going to attack Israel with them, and then we're going to be on the hook for being anti-Semitic and being against Israel. And they couldn't do that openly. They decided they weren't going to. Although they knew that all their eggs were over in the Arab basket, they didn't want to see a war between the Jews and the Arabs, because that put them on this dilemma. So inevitably, Nasser, the president of Egypt, threatened the Eisenhower administration finally and said, if you don't give me the tanks and the planes, I will go to Moscow, and don't think I can't. And of course, what did he do? He followed through on the threat. He invited the Russians into Egypt, and he became a satellite of the Soviet Union, and they supplied him with the tanks and the MiG fighters and the self-propelled guns and everything he needed to form a modern Egyptian army. And that was what and then what did he do? Seeing himself bloating up with this modern army, he nationalized the Suez Canal, which is the Suez Crisis. And of course, immediately the news traveled to Prime Minister Anthony Eden in the UK. He was actually, at the moment he found out, he was entertaining the president and king of Iraq, um, and he broke off the meeting. He had an emergency cabinet meeting later that night, and the next morning he gave a speech saying that, you can't take our property. We can't. The way he put it is, we can't have Nasser's thumb on our lifeline, which they saw the Suez Canal as their lifeline to the Far East. And so that began the Suez Crisis, where France, Britain, and Israel united to invade Egypt and overthrow Nasser. Do you have any comments on the Suez Crisis?
I don't know that much about the Suez Crisis. I recently came across that topic when I was looking into Lord Louis Mountbatten, because he was that powerful, and his close colleague, Baron Hastings Ismay, became the first Secretary General of NATO. And this duo, they screwed up in many places, like Egypt, and this made them look very suspicious. So the French started to suspect Louis Mountbatten. The British did as well. The Americans, they already had a file on Mountbatten, because everybody thought whatever they touch, they screw it up. They screw it up for the West, and it's sort of what they do. It always helps the Soviets. And when it came to the state of Israel, once there was a state, because they didn't have one for the longest time, this was the moment, these Israelis, they could form a military, they could form their own intelligence services, they could form, they could pursue nuclear weapons, but there was always this infiltration problem. And of course, when this tiny little state is threatened that much, of course you see Israel. Of course, you saw Israel becoming more assertive and more aggressive, not just in diplomacy, but also with secret operations. Secret operations against the Muslims, but also some secret operations, influencing Western policy, right? Because there was so many bad things that had been decided by the British and others. All these bad choices were made, so that kind of explains some of these assertive this assertive new style that we saw from Israel, when some of these operations were meant to influence Western politics. And so then with the nuclear program of Israel, when they try to get help from buying stuff from Britain and France and other places, after the fact. Israel got blamed for the Kennedy assassination. And the motive that was stated by some authors and, these internet warriors, the motive stated was the Israeli nuclear program, because Kennedy and some others, they were not a fan of the idea for obvious reasons, because once Israel becomes a nuclear power, some of these Arabs and other Muslim states, these Muslims might become nuclear powers, and these Muslims might get help from the Soviet Union. So that was just an internal debate in America, and so many people, for good reasons, having even Israel's interests in mind, some people like Kennedy, they were against it, especially at that moment in time. But of course, this got misconstrued later, and now you see people on the internet saying that the Jews killed Kennedy because he wouldn't let them have nuclear weapons. Now, we talked about the Kennedy assassinations just a few weeks ago, and we made it clear, Oswald was this very committed communist. He knew about communist literature, so he knew about the terror strategy of communism, and killing a head of state was very much in line with this communist terror strategy. So he was not a lone nut. He was not alone. He had contacts, the KGB, and he was in the Soviet Union. And he was not a nut. He was a committed terrorist, which oftentimes is kind of the same, but this is kind of like this crazy thing that we hear nowadays, especially with this this, the war with Hamas, people bring up this old stuff and they say, the Israelis killed Kennedy because of the nuclear weapons, and now of course you had this limited strike by Israel against Iranian targets. And when you look into this event a few weeks ago, what the Israelis were hitting was the defense systems, these advanced defense systems that the Iranians mostly got from the Russians. And these defense systems, they are protecting the Iranian nuclear program. So this is like the problem, that goes back to the Kennedy era, the Kennedy administration. Should Israel have nuclear weapons, and what will the Muslims do when Israel gets these missiles or these warheads?
Yeah. Well, in the Suez Crisis, how it was resolved was the British, the French, and the Israelis were going to take out Nasser. Nasser was a pan-Arabist. He was a flamboyant, kind of charismatic personality. The whole Arab world would be on the side of Nasser, and this would be against the UN Charter to invade a sovereign country. I think technically the nationalization of the canal did not justify an invasion by international law, if I understand correctly. And but the CIA initially under Alan Dulles supported the British operation and did what it could initially. But then the CIA found out that the British plans did not stop with taking over Egypt. The British plan was to have coup d'etats against the Syrian government and the Iraqi, Syrian government and the Saudi government. The British wanted to put in their own puppet king, and the CIA was appalled, and the Eisenhower administration was shocked. They said, no, you can't touch the king of Saudi Arabia. He's our puppet, right? That's Aramco. That's our oil. You can't, so suddenly the Americans were like, what are the British doing? They're not just going to take Egypt. They're going to go grab Saudi Arabia where we have interests. So this was, and it was George Young, the deputy head of MI6, that was going around saying, oh yeah, we ought to take over Saudi Arabia and stuff. And of course, that kind of soured. I think that might have been what soured the Americans on supporting it, aside from our desire to keep our Arab friends. The oil was important to us. So Eisenhower, went against this invasion of our allies, the French and the British, of Egypt. And basically there was talk of economic sanctions on Britain, and of course the political pressure and pressure from the UN denouncing the invasion. So the British Prime Minister Eden had egg on his face. The French and the British, they ended up having to cancel the whole thing. So the Israeli troops withdrew from Sinai, and they withdrew. And it was a rift formed. There was bad blood then between the British Americans, the British and the Americans, and the Americans and the French, because of this. And exactly at this moment, the Hungarian people rose up against their communist government.
And were squashed.
They rose up against it. And of course, NATO wasn't unified. NATO was disunited by this argument over Egypt, the invasion of Egypt. And of course, we confronted our allies about invading Egypt, but we didn't confront the Soviet Union about then invading Hungary.
Yeah, the argument at the time oftentimes was Europe first. So Europe is more important than the Muslim world. So this kind of influenced certain decisions, because remember, in the 50s, I think in the 50s, we the Germans, we didn't even have an army yet, because we were still prohibited after World War II. We couldn't have an army, and they sort of started it slowly, and they kind of started to build this thing. So oftentimes the focus was on Europe, and that influenced decisions made for the Muslim world. And the British, they were always doing these weird things, because some of these Muslim countries, they were influenced by the British Fabian Society, which was kind of a leftist organization, London School of Economics and the Fabians. And so they created this sort of Muslim nationalist version of Fabian socialism. Now, there's books on this, actually. And so this was a strange thing that the British did. And so the British and the Americans, they were not as close as some people may think, especially at that time, because Britain was still trying to be an old school empire. And I recently read this book that I mentioned a couple of shows ago about the American General Stilwell and the British Supreme Commander Lord Louis Mountbatten, in the Chinese Burma-India theater. So the American general, the Americans, they had all these great ideas, what to do with China, what to do with India, what to do with this and that, and Burma and everything. And the British, they always had their own ideas. So these ideas clashed with the Americans. And so this is why Stilwell and Mountbatten didn't get along, because the implication always was the British are trying to screw us. They try to secure, Singapore, or they had some other ideas about various countries. It's because it's like this myth that the Americans and the British were always working in tandem, and they always understood each other. They were always trusting each other. It's much more complicated.
Yeah, there's a strain in American thinking. We didn't like imperialism because we were part of the British Empire and we revolted. So there is an anti-imperialist streak in American thought and history. So we were really at odds with the British, and the British, of course, were so upset they decided to not play anymore. At that point, they weren't going to help us out in the Middle East and these other areas. And of course, Nasser was the big winner. And not that he was going to be grateful to Eisenhower, by the way. The Saudis might have been impressed by Eisenhower, preventing a British-French takeover of the Middle East again. But Nasser stuck with the Soviets and thought that Eisenhower was weak because he had done that. And so he just went whole hog. He wanted more weapons. He wanted to be stronger because he didn't want any future invasion to threaten him again. And he basically was even more gung-ho for having the Soviets design his army, design his strategy, and he wanted to fight ultimately a war with Israel. And he wanted to unify the Arab world. There was this union for a period of years, between Syria and Egypt. It was called the United Arab Republics. I think it was a UAR. In which there was kind of a federated union between Egypt and Syria. And of course, these were the countries that were really being built up by the Soviets. The Soviets were in Syria, supporting the Syrian regime of Hafez al-Assad, and they were supporting Nasser. And of course, this buildup in the Arab world of Soviet arms also meant the Soviets were infiltrating Egypt, infiltrating Syria, with their agents in the hopes of a future larger war, which ended up happening in 1967, what we know as the Six-Day War. And of course, this again, President Johnson was the president, and America was again placed in this unusual situation. Nasser urged King Hussein of Jordan to enter the war. And of course, what happened was, however, the Arabist regimes, the Pan-Arabist regimes, and the Syrian regime was secular. And in early 1967, a Syrian newspaper, army newspaper, attacked Muhammad the Prophet in Islam. And this created such an uproar in Syria, it weakened the regime, and the Soviets were afraid that Syria was going to collapse. Know how there's a civil war in Syria now for years, fought between these different factions. And of course, Russia was very afraid of losing its satellite in Syria. And so Andrei Gromyko, the Soviet foreign minister, flew to Egypt for a secret meeting with Nasser, saying, you have to support, the best way you can support Syria right now is to demonstrate your power against Israel. That will help to unify and heal this problem in Syria. So, send your armies into the Sinai, which was, of course, the Sinai is right up against Israel's open, hard to defend southern border. And this, of course, was provocative to Israel, but the Russians figured that it was just a maneuver. It wasn't going to do anything. But hothead that Nasser was, he gets into the Sinai, and of course, there's a strait there in the Gulf of Aqaba that can blockade Israel's one port that goes on into the Red Sea, and he decided to blockade it, which was an act of war against Israel. And the Israelis started to move towards war, and the Soviets came and said, no, talk, don't make war, because they were scared to death with the weakness of Syria at this moment, that if the war began at this point, both Syria and Egypt would be destroyed, and all their investment, military investment in those two regimes would be for nothing. But the Israelis, the Jews, didn't listen to the Soviets. They didn't do the negotiation. And so it came to the point where both sides were going to attack each other, because the Jews mobilized, the Arabs were mobilizing, and it was a matter of who struck first. And Israel struck first, destroyed the Arab air forces, and then destroyed in sequence the Syrian army and the Egyptian army. In 6 days, conquered. And Jordan, the Nasser pressured the king of Jordan to enter the war, which is the West Bank. Jordan's border runs right through Jerusalem, right along that line there that became the occupied West Bank. And so the Jews got the Golan Heights from Syria, they got the West Bank from Jordan, and they took the Sinai from Egypt, which was in 6 days, a massive blitzkrieg victory. Great humiliation for the Russians as the helpers of the Egyptians and the Syrians. Not exactly recommended, but of course, Nasser was a bungler, and the Syrians were weak. So this was this watershed event in Middle Eastern history, this actual catastrophe that Soviet arms and advisors produced, mixed with the Arab misadventures.
Yeah.
And of course created the West Bank problem, the Gaza problem, the Golan Heights problem, and so on.
Yeah, many problems. And there was another important incident in the early 1950s, of course, in Iran. Maybe just quickly mention that, of course. So initially in the early 50s, you had Mossadegh. He was trying to create this Muslim, or this nationalist socialism thing that I was mentioning earlier. So just the state takes over everything. The refineries of the Anglo-Iranian oil company, just using sort of this anti-imperialist argument, all this noise, and trying to introduce the socialist concept, of just taking all the industry over. And then he was removed by the Operation TP Ajax, and that created the new state of the Shah of Persia, and that was of course a bummer for the Soviets. The
Soviets lost all their influence in Iran at that point, didn't they?
Yeah, and it took until 1979 for the Soviets to get their people back in power in Iran, with Khomeini and all that. And of course, every event like this saw a big propaganda campaign, a big propaganda push. So, of course, the old Mossadegh was painted as this big hero, the liberator. The Shah was the devil, and then of course Khomeini was glorified, and there was a lot of leftist influence that was visible, and of course there was the Soviet intelligence in the background. And this is sort of, I mean, there are new books on the Iranian topic now, and this is sort of viewed as an intelligence failure on the side of the Americans. You know, they were not able to prevent the events of 1979, and ever since then, of course, there was a battle of the historic interpretation, just like with Vietnam and all these other many topics. You know, it was always about how can we get a certain narrative across? How can we turn this into a black and white, very simple black and white issue? And it's like
the marriage between Muslim countries' oil, the oil in Iran and the oil in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, is this love affair between the West, the British and the Americans, and the Iranians and the Arabs. This is what has made this strong position that the United States has had in the Middle East, which is now completely eroded away, by the way, because the Saudis have now turned towards China and Russia, which is a catastrophe. And of course, Iran is with Russia and China. It is a regime of their type. And so America had these intrinsic advantages. And I think it was ultimately, the Middle East was important, maybe more important because of America's allies, Japan and Europe, needed that Middle Eastern oil for their industrial development and that cheap oil to keep them, prosperous and to keep the West whole. So the Middle East was part of the West and also part of Ronald Reagan's strategy as we get into the 1980s. This alliance with Saudi Arabia, they manipulated oil prices to damage the Soviet economy and the Soviet oil exports back in the 1980s when the Soviets began trading in oil as well as minerals. So, and this was part of the strategic warfare that Reagan waged against the Soviet Union. So the Middle East, I mean, it was our playground. And because we were able to maintain friendships with the Arabs and with the Israelis, except for that brief moment, now the Yom Kippur War is the next one. Nasser didn't give up. He was going to redouble his efforts and come back. Of course, he died of a heart attack in 1970. And Anwar al-Sadat took over Egypt again as a leader of a satellite of the Soviet Union. And this military buildup, this time the Soviets were going to do it right. They really built the Egyptian military especially very solidly. Meanwhile, the Israelis had built a defensive line along the Suez Canal, the Bar-Lev line, which was like the Maginot Line, with a moat, with its own moat, the Suez Canal. And of course, they had the West Bank, which is a stronger defense line. But of course, Jordan didn't participate in the Yom Kippur War, right? Did not participate. And of course, it was a surprise attack done on the high, called the Yom Kippur War, because they attacked on Yom Kippur, what is it? The Jewish holiday of atonement. Is that it? It's one of the holiest holidays in the Jewish calendar. And of course, there were lots of indications of the attack coming, but nobody listened. So the Arabs achieved then real surprise and were able to compete in the air for the first time and broke the Bar-Lev line. In Egyptian Third Army broke into the Sinai. And of course, the Syrians were stopped in the Golan Heights. Their tanks were wrecked. But the Egyptians had tremendous success, and Egypt almost won. Israel was running out of ammunition, and this is the first time Nixon began an airlift to airlift ammunition. This is the first time America actively helped Israel in a war. We had really not helped them in the 6-Day War. We were, again, a little bit afraid of alienating our Arab allies, but because of this, the Arab world in Saudi Arabia, they did this oil embargo against us. And I remember in that year, there was no gasoline to be gotten anywhere. Everybody's gas tanks were on empty. And when a gas station had a little, you had this giant line of cars trying to compete to get the gasoline. And so this was our first experience in the West of the power of the Arab oil embargo.
Yeah. Of course, when what can you say about this this Iran Contra affair? Because I think now when we're talking about a Cold War, I think this was sort of a hot topic, very very important chapter.
Well, of course, the Iranian Revolution in '79 was the fly in the ointment for Jimmy Carter's presidency. Um, Jimmy Carter had done this amazing thing at the Camp David Accords. Of course, this war, what happened is that at the end of the Yom Kippur War, Egyptian Third Army got cut off by a air mobile attack led by Ariel Sharon, I think, conceived of it, the Israeli general, and it basically they crossed to the Egyptian side of the canal, and they destroyed Egyptian rear area behind Egyptian Third Army, trapping it. And of course, it meant the complete collapse of the Egyptian military if this worked. It was like pocketing a whole army. It was a catastrophe. And so the Soviet Union began mobilizing and saying it was going to intervene. Soviet paratroops were being ready to come to the Middle East as the first responders. And of course, Nixon, I remember it came across the radio. We were all in shock that the order had gone out that all American military personnel were to report to their bases. So this was scary. This was scary because the Soviet Union was going to intervene. America was now preparing to begin to mobilize. And of course, this is where Kissinger and Nixon came in, and they started this peace process over to end this war. Because this Yom Kippur War was not just 6 days. This thing dragged on for weeks and was very bloody. And of course, what ended up happening after Watergate, when Carter came in, after Ford was president, Carter started this Camp David process where Menachem Begin, the prime minister of Israel, and Anwar Sadat where they arranged them to meet. And Sadat did this amazingly courageous thing. He went to Israel. And this was something nobody thought would happen because of the hatred between the Arabs. Sadat was going to be this peacemaker because Sadat had been, moved by the death of friends and relatives in this war. It had been really bloody. And why are we fighting this? And Sadat did this other thing. He threw the Soviet military advisors out of Egypt, and he said this was a mistake. We shouldn't have had anything to do with these Russians. And of course, there were multiple assassination attempts against Sadat because the Soviets wanted to kill him to put their man in place behind him. And of course, this did not come off. They failed in these assassination attempts, and Sadat got more and more further away from the Soviet Union. And of course, Sadat needed to deal with the Americans. He needed military support because he wasn't going to get any more Soviet military equipment. He needed military equipment from the Americans and to make Egypt viable. And so that was a change. So the United States at this moment had not only Iran and Saudi Arabia, the money storehouse in the Gulf states, but we had won over Egypt and made this peace. This was a tremendous victory in the Cold War, and it is owed to Jimmy Carter. But then Jimmy Carter, in his wanting regimes that he helped to be perfect, did not support the Shah adequately, did not realize this revolution against the Shah had communist elements in it, and that the Islamic movement in Iran was totalitarian. They let that regime fall. And of course, there was simultaneously an East Bloc attempt to overthrow Saudi Arabia. There was a revolt at the Grand Mosque in Mecca. And of course, it was no coincidence that these Arab revolutionaries against Saudi Arabia were trained by Libyans and East Germans. And maybe you can comment on that attempt. So there were attempts at revolutions in Saudi Arabia by the communists and in Iran at the same time.
I have some notes here. Well, it's kind of like what the superpowers what they were thinking or considering, in that region. So the Soviets were standing in northern Iran in 1946 and wanted to take Tehran, but decided against it to have more resources available for Europe. And so
Iran was Persia, as it was known then, was partitioned during World War II. They had a partition line that ran through the middle of the country. The north of the country was occupied by the Soviet army, and the south by the British. So that ended after the war, and the Soviets withdrew under pressure from the Allies.
Exactly. But that was not the end of it.
No, they left behind all the structures they had set up while they were there. They had set up their own fronts and agent networks.
In 1968, the British left the region while maintaining some espionage networks. The Americans mainly wanted to work with Iran under the Shah and with Saudi Arabia. And then, of course, the CIA failed at reading the situation. And in 1979, the mullahs took over with the help of the Soviets. And Zbigniew Brzezinski wanted to stage a military coup as a response to that mullah takeover. And the United States supported Saddam Hussein in the war against Iran.
You forgot the hostages. When the Iranian Revolution happened, they stormed, and it was I think it was Yosef Bodansky presented evidence that the KGB was involved in the storming of the American embassy and the taking of the American embassy staff as hostages. And that was huge. That hung over Jimmy Carter. That was like an albatross around his neck.
And
he lost the election.
And Brzezinski was important in the Carter admin, right? He was
he was Carter's national security advisor. Exactly. And of course, there was the disastrous. They had organized a military raid to rescue the hostages, a military attack, which had to refuel in the desert. And there was this terrible accident where the American military helicopters in the dark, in the desert, rendezvousing, crashed into each other. And the operation turned into a fiery series of helicopter crashes, which left dead, burnt American bodies. I can remember this mullah, television footage of this mullah dancing and being exultant over these dead, burnt to death Americans that were lying there on this airstrip. And I forgot what the operation was called, but it was a complete failure. And there was no rescuing these hostages. And Jimmy Carter was humiliated by the Ayatollah Khomeini.
So then larger American military forces in the region were out of the question because the planners expected a major war in Europe. Soviet troops were stationed in Afghanistan and were theoretically able to move into Pakistan or Iran. But the performance of the Russians in Afghanistan was already not good, and we saw the usual logistics problems. And
in 79, it was actually December of 79, which was, I think, a month after the revolution in Iran, that the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. And of course, so you had an attempt to take over Saudi Arabia with the events at the Grand Mosque, and you had the revolution in Iran, and then you had the Soviet invasion, all in late 79. All of these events happening in 79. And of course, the invasion of Afghanistan was, I think it was 80,000 Soviet troops came into Afghanistan, and they had tricked. I had dinner once with the former health minister of Afghanistan, who told me that they'd basically tricked the naive Marxist Afghan president into believing the Americans were going to invade Afghanistan through Pakistan. And of course, we're coming in to help you. But once they got in, he said, we threw a party for their Russian military people, officers. And in came Spetsnaz through the windows, took the whole government hostage, and of course, assassinated most of the government, replaced it. He managed to escape from prison. He got away to the west, but they killed, they basically replaced the government in Afghanistan that had invited them in. So this was the story he told anyway. But it's the Soviets took over Afghanistan at the same time. So this was a major Soviet move on the Middle East.
Up to 24 Russian divisions would have been necessary to invade Iran, according to the estimates back then. The United States and the USSR had hundreds of small nuclear weapons ready for a clash in the desert. There were also the man-pack nukes that could be buried to destroy a tunnel or a pass if necessary. And Iran, under Khomeini, smelled the danger that the superpowers could become, active in that region. And in 1982, a Soviet KGB defector formerly stationed in Iran, Vladimir Kutsichkin, gave intel to the British MI6, who gave it to the CIA, who in turn handed it over to Iran. This is how Iranians were able to eliminate communist agent networks. And the CIA overall knew very little about what was going on in Iran. Then Reagan started the Iranian Covert Action Program. The agency shared more intelligence with Iran and wanted to create sympathies for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. At the same time, preparations were made for armed groups against the Iranian government, just to make sure, just to have a backup option. But the plan didn't really, or that really didn't work. Iranian officers had often visited American schools, but bigger groups were impossible to set up in that time span. And in late 1987, it looked as if Iran would launch a naval attack on Saudi Arabia, and that's when Iran's President Khatami and the United States were getting closer. Then came the U.S. attack against Iraq, and of course the Iranians made everything much harder for Americans. Ultimately, Iran offered the Americans a deal, a shady deal, of course. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad restarted the nuclear program. The United States and Israel responded with hacker attacks, mobile internet for dissidents, and different black ops. So this is sort of the, in a nutshell, sort of what kept on happening throughout the 80s.
Well, I think we've reached our time limit. We've gone a long time, and this is a good place to leave off. So we've covered many of the major events up into the 1980s, around 1980, of the Middle East. Maybe we can do the Iran-Contra and some of the recent ones in the first and second Gulf War next week, and try to get caught up on all that. I'm Jeff Nyquist. My co-host has been Alex Benesch. We've been talking about the Middle East through the Cold War to try to understand the interplay between anti-Semitism, communism, pan-Arabism, and Islam, and this complicated game that has evolved. And I want to thank you for joining us, and hope you will join me next week for another edition of Friends and Enemies.